Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on the Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Good morning to you once again, because you're in Canada. Good evening to everybody who is in Japan, and good afternoon to the people in Europe, I would say. So, thank you for joining us today again. Dr. Nagy is with us, and today the topic is why an Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. So, the Indo-Pacific is a relatively new concept in general, but adding to it the economy factor is, it takes it to another level, I believe. So, Stephen, without any further ado and any further delay, I'm going to give the floor to you. And as always, everybody who has followed us for a while knows that when Stephen finishes the briefing, we open the floor to discussion. So feel free to raise your hand and we'll bring you up on stage here. You can share your thoughts, your observations. Of course, if you have research results, you're welcome to share them with us as well. So, Stephen, the floor is yours. Let's begin.
Oh, great. So thank you very much, Maya, and good morning, everybody from Canada, where I am, for the last clubhouse of this year for me from a foreign country, and I'll be back in Japan later this week. And good evening and good afternoon to everybody else from all around the world, which is great. Today we're talking about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and I think that it's a really, really interesting initiative for us to be thinking about. It came online, or it was launched by the United States back in May 2020, when Mr. Biden visited the region. And some of the interesting characteristics about it is that in some ways it overlaps with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which does not include India, but the IPEF, as we call it, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, does include India. It actually includes 14 countries, most of the RCEP members except for China, and some additional, I think, important countries like Fiji, which is kind of representing the Pacific Islands. So what we've seen to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is that the United States is trying to create a framework, and this framework is meant to be as inclusive as possible. The key questions that we have is, what makes the IPEF different from existing economic frameworks such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership or the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So what I'd like to do today is talk about why it's different. And I'm going to do this from the viewpoint of participation. I want to talk about the 4 areas that are focused in IPEF, which is fair and resilient trade, supply chains, infrastructure, clean energy and decarbonization, and lastly, tax and anti-corruption. And then third, what I'd like to talk about is this idea of standard setting and a movement away from large-scale trade agreements towards focusing on a standard setting, and why that's important and why IPF serves an important role in that particular area. So that's the 3 themes I'd like to focus on today. So let's pivot back to that first theme. So we're looking at the current members of the IPEF, and it's something that will gradually expand. It's important to see that most of the members of ASEAN plus 6 are there, except for China. And why that's important is that the Economic Framework, or IPEF, is trying to create an inclusive bubble that will continue to expand with countries that are sharing the same view about the importance of standard setting, but the other core areas of the IPEF agreement. The inclusion of India is really important to ensure that India understands that despite the issues with regards to Russia and not taking a position, or it's taking a neutral position regarding Russia and its hesitancy to take a broader security position within the Indo-Pacific broadly, that the United States recognizes India as a key and critical partner in any kind of economic framework going forward, and that India will be equal partner, as an emerging partner for the United States and other participating countries moving forward in terms of setting standards and shaping global trade, and in this case standards that I'm going to come back to. The inclusion of Fiji is also really, really important. And as you know, since the beginning of this year, in particular in April, March, what we've seen is a lot of media coverage about the Chinese and their diplomatic engagement in Southeast, in the Pacific Islands, with potentially a non-disclosed security agreement being signed between the Chinese and the Solomon Islands. And what we saw as a response to that is the Biden administration, as well as Japan and France and others, decide to include a Pacific Island country in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And they're opening up the doors so that more Pacific Islands can join this framework. And this is why we see some of the themes also being focused on environment-related themes such as clean energy and decarbonization. Because for the Pacific Islands, trade is important. Being part of the global economy is important, but of course, climate change is an existential threat for these countries as sea levels rise, and they need economic frameworks that are going to tackle these areas. So the inclusion of Fiji, I think, is really, really important in terms of thinking about the United States addressing the existential threats and concerns of Pacific Island nations. And what we will likely see moving over the next 3 or 4 years is more Pacific Island countries participating in the IPEF agreement as the details of the agreement become more concrete. And again, that focus on the environmental side of trade. So yeah, so inclusion of these countries are really, really important. Other important countries, of course, is Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, New Zealand, Philippines, and others. Why say these countries are important? Because they're major economic countries. But the inclusion of both Japan and South Korea, I think, is really important in terms of fixing this relationship and moving this relationship forward in a more productive relationship alongside the United States and likely Australia and others. How far this relationship will move forward is slightly a different story, but we should understand that it's a symbolic gesture of shifting away from the previous Korean government's views about Japan and views about trilateral cooperation with the United States, and its positions vis-a-vis China towards a more cooperative position and reshaping the region. I think South Korea's inclusion is also important because of its increasing broader role in supply chains, in building alternative semiconductor production zones to take off some of the pressure of the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company, but also to ensure that the weaponization of technology supply chains is not something that becomes a reality in the next 5 to 10 years before these systems come online. So again, the first part of today's discussion is about who's participating and who's not. And of course, China's not part of this agreement. And you might be saying, that doesn't really make sense. It's the second biggest economy. It has a huge number of middle-class consumers. It will continue to grow, even though its economy is slowing. So why isn't it included? And here, this will be further explained when we're talking about standard setting in the third part of this discussion, is that because this economic framework is focused on standard setting, and ensuring that a shared standard set will be adopted throughout the region in many different technological industries and economic industries, that China has been excluded. And I don't think there's a place at the door for China in this particular agreement. So let's pivot to the 4 themes that are proposed by the IPEF agreement: fair and resilient trade, supply chain resilience, infrastructure, clean energy and decarbonization, and lastly, tax and anti-corruption. So when we're thinking about these 4 categories, fair and resilient trade, so resilient trade has become a key term through the pandemic and post-pandemic. We're all experiencing inflation. We're all experiencing delays in getting our goods from wherever they're being produced in the Indo-Pacific region, in particular China. So resilient trade and a resilient trade means that supply chains associated with trade, but also the depoliticization of trade, which basically means ensuring that geopolitics doesn't affect trade between countries, continues to remain resilient. And that means building different supply chains. That means building new trading partners and building trade agreements that are considered fair. That means letting the market forces dictate winners and losers in economic competition. Now, this particular area, again, this particular theme of the IPEF agreement really is exclusive, and especially when we're talking about the fair aspect of trade. And why we say it's exclusive is that if we're focused on market forces driving trade, then some of the recent trends in China in terms of the growing role of state-owned enterprises, the state taking a role in managing technology industries, really means that the state is not letting market forces dictate competition. And this is something that the United States, Canada, Japan, and South Korea are worried about. If they have to compete with state-owned enterprises, the competition really isn't fair, and it makes it more difficult to be competitive and shape economic growth. Supply chain resilience, again, this goes back to this point about geopolitics affecting supply chains, but also non-traditional security challenges. And the COVID-19 pandemic was a very, very good example of this, where supply chains have broken down because of domestic COVID policies in the Chinese context. But we're going to see more non-traditional security challenges moving forward. So when IPEF is talking about supply chain resilience, it's not talking about decoupling. It's talking about selective diversification of supply chain away from China in certain areas, but also building alternative supply chains in Southeast Asia and South through overseas development assistance, foreign direct investment, and working with other minilateral organizations such as the Quad. And we've already started seeing this with governments like Japan back in May 2020, adopting additional budgets to reshore some manufacturing, but also to build some resilience into supply chains in South and South Asia. And this will continue. And the benefactors, of course, will be, or the beneficiaries will be, of course, Southeast Asia and South Asia. As more infrastructure, more supply chains are built up, this will help with their economic growth and development. And of course, inculcate them more into a broader regional economic framework. In terms of infrastructure, clean energy, and decarbonization, these are linked. And what we're seeing now is that infrastructure and connectivity is being linked to building environmentally free or clean energy and decarbonized infrastructure and connectivity to deal with some of the difficulties of climate change moving forward. And here, these are welcome initiatives by countries that are facing climate change or facing an increasingly severe environment. Of course, the Pacific Islands are important here, but as we've all experienced a very hot summer this year, that working and building infrastructure and connectivity that, through clean energy and helping build clean energy and decarbonizing our economies is a really important step in dealing with some of the emerging challenges within the Indo-Pacific region. And, I encourage you to think about this in places like Southeast Asia and the Mekong Delta. It's the breadbasket for Southeast Asia and much of Northeast Asia. Or if you go to parts of India and Bangladesh, all of these areas are really sensitive to climate change. And without thinking more about how economic development and infrastructure is related to the environment, these areas will be challenged moving forward. And I should, of course, also focus on the Pacific Islands on this last point. The fourth area is tax and anti-corruption. And here, this is quite interesting, and I think it's related to the tax part is related to creating a broader accepted norm of taxation throughout the Indo-Pacific region. To ensure that corporations are paying their taxes, and those taxes go to paying for some of these initiatives. The anti-corruption side is related to ensuring that transparency and a so-called rules-based process to economic development and international relations is front and center of the IPEF agreement. And why this is important is there are concerns that corruption has impacted and is impacting the development of countries in Southeast Asia and South Central Asia through backdoor channels. The BRI has been able to garner momentum through various forms of corruption, and of course, this does not improve governance. And it doesn't improve the general lot of ordinary citizens. So this is something that I think IPEF is aiming to achieve. Lastly, I want to pivot to this idea of standard setting and why I think IPEF is a very important agreement, although it's just at the start of where it's moving. It's a framework that will continue to evolve moving forward, focusing on standard setting. Now, why is standard setting important? Standards will shape how we use technology. It'll shape how governments engage in technologies and allow citizens to use technologies and other forms of economy and trade engagement, and this will shape our behavior as citizens. But it will also shape how we are governed by our respective governments. And here, what we see is that working with the United States and like-minded countries is they would like to shape the Indo-Pacific region through a common set of standards. And those standards are going to focus on emerging technologies such as AI and quantum computing, but also in the area of cyberspace, in the area of digital privacy, in the area of how we engage in digital commerce. And this is something that the standards are now being written. And the question is who writes the standards will likely shape how these industries and these technologies and governments develops in the coming years. And this is really, really critical. And whoever shapes and wins this standard setting competition will accrue largely the benefits, or the economic benefits that come with being the standard setters, but also again shape how countries are governed in the region. And I'm not talking about democratic governance versus soft authoritarianism or hard authoritarianism. I'm talking about good governance, so transparency, rule of law, rules-based engagement within the region. So you might be saying, wow, why are standards so important? Well, most of us are listening on our Android phones or through the web, and those standards were set in the United States. And that means most of the financial gain associated with the internet and the standards that were built into the internet as we use today, those financial gains went to U.S. businesses and U.S. companies, and of course they set the rules of how we use these technologies. I think this is a really, really excellent example of how standards can shape our consumer behavior and how we engage in trade, economy, and now the digital environment. And I think rather than free trade and open access to markets as being the primary focus of the IPEF, and I think the primary focus of countries like the United States and Japan and others, that they see more selective trade, but also ensuring that standards are set by like-minded countries to shape, again, the Indo-Pacific region. So again, for me, when I look at the Indo-Pacific framework and why it's our economic framework and why it's important for the region, I look at who's participating. I look at the four initiatives and why they're important. And then lastly, the standard setting aspect of the Indo-Pacific framework and how this is related to broadly shaping the Indo-Pacific region's development and assuring that more transparency and a more rules-based process is the foundation for standard settings moving forward, rather than standards that have been set by authoritarian states that really have a very different model of the relationship between citizens and government. So that's a few appetizers on the table, and now it's up to you to bring the main course, or at least ask some questions.
Thank you, Stephen. So just a few things. If you get notification that somebody wants to come up on stage, please let them do that. I will do the same. So just the application I use at the moment does not allow me to see everybody, unfortunately. So Eleanor, good morning to you.
Good morning, Stephen and Maya. It's great to be with you guys as always. Since I'm in Washington, we've been talking about the IPEF a lot recently, as Stephen noted that this is really the Biden administration's kind of blueprint for economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific on a multilateral basis. So I wanted to add a few things which will kind of overlap with Stephen's multiple buckets here. So first of all, I do think it is important to keep in mind that although there are 14 countries, so these countries don't have to join IPEF and join all four pillars of the IPEF. They can choose which pillar or pillars that they'd like to join. And we have yet to see just which pillars each of these countries have to join in. And I think this is very important because I think the Biden administration realizes that some of these countries, like India, for example, were reluctant to join IPEF for various reasons, with I believe India being because they do have a preference for bilateral trade negotiations. So that's a reason. And then for some countries, there were hesitancies about I think a big one is about market access, which I will come back to. Yep, I will come back to that at the end, or I'll try to remember to come back to at the end. And the second part, Stephen definitely noted about Fiji. But the interesting thing about Fiji, in addition to what Stephen mentioned about, the alarming security or announced security pact between the Solomon Islands and China, and of course the U.S.'s response being that we will actually establish a few embassies in the area, is the fact that Fiji was actually not initially announced as a member country when IPEF was formally launched while Biden was in Tokyo. And so that was actually, I'm sure to many, it was very welcome news. So it's interesting to see how some of the countries, I think when the IPEF was launched in the Quad, there were 12 or 13 countries, and Fiji was actually announced a few days later. So from an optics standpoint, so we'll see later on if other countries decide to join in the future, because IPEF, as Stephen noted, it's just beginning, I think, but negotiations are closer to ending or they have already ended. So in terms of the four pillars, so one thing that I wanted to note was the anti-corruption pillar, which isn't talked about as much here in DC. I think a lot of people in DC talk a lot more about like supply chain resilience and the fair and resilient trade pillar. For one reason being because of semiconductors, of which President Biden did just sign the Chips and Sciences Act finally after 2+ years of negotiations within both houses. So I don't know if this is talked about very much, but the Biden administration actually last December, around the time that they hosted the Summit for Democracies, they actually launched, I believe, the first White House or national strategy for countering corruption. So if you're anybody interested in the anti-corruption space, it's called the United States Strategy on Countering Corruption. And it was interesting that as a part of a working group on countering corruption or corruption more broadly, when this report was launched, and it's pretty comprehensive. There's a lot there. It's about 30 or 40 pages long. So it is, if you ever have time, it might be worth reading. I think so that pillar, the anti-corruption and taxation part, does fall into line, I believe, with this national strategy for countering corruption. And it does definitely apply to the Indo-Pacific and not just within the context of the IPEF. So, and I think one frustration that many, thought leaders who are not part of the Biden administration, so in other words, those who are in academia or think tank community might have frustration over with IPEF, is the fact that it does not provide market access to the countries that are part of IPEF. And I do believe that that is very deliberate, of course, for one reason being, I think, U.S. domestic politics. President Trump did withdraw the U.S. from Trans-Pacific Partnership, or what is now known as CPTPP. And I think in this case, I think were IPEF to provide market access, it would then have to go through U.S. Congress. And I don't think there is bandwidth. And I think given the fact that it's more likely than not right now that the Republicans will take over the House on November 8th, there is no political appetite to pass something like CPTPP, although it is ideal for many here in Washington as well as Indo-Pacific capitals. So I think one key question that really, for those of you interested in watching this space war, that the Biden administration or future administrations will really need to take a deep look at is how can the United States, offer these kind of initiatives that basically emphasize standard setting without offering market access. Will these Indo-Pacific capitals, both that are in IPEF and those that are not, will they have appetite to join U.S.-led initiatives on standards going forward? So I'll end there to see what kind of comments I received. Thank you so much.
Oh, excuse me. Eleanor, as insightful as always, thank you very much. So, I guess I have various questions or various thoughts on the idea of market access, and is this the best tool to shape the region with the Indo-Pacific region? And there are some arguments to be made that large multilateral trade agreements that include China are not in the interests of the United States and actually weaken the United States and some of its partners' abilities to shape Chinese behavior. And in those arguments, they use the World Trade Organization as part of their argument. They say, look at what happened with China and the World Trade Organization. The size of the Chinese market has warped trade going forward, and they've benefited in an unbalanced way. And as a result, we see these huge trade deficits. We've empowered China, and that now today we have to deal with a very different Chinese government and Chinese economy, which is very, very challenging. So this is one view, and I think that they forget to think about all the benefits that we receive from being, having China part of the WTO and making cheap goods for us to consume. But that is one view, and that by opening up the U.S. market access is that they put the United States in a weaker position, and that they are in a better position to selectively open their market to particular economies like Canada or Mexico through the NAFTA 2.0 agreement, or Japan through the minilateral agreement that they signed in September 2019 or 2020, before the pandemic started, and that this is a better way to protect the U.S. economy, but use the size of its economy to shape the behavior of other states. The jury's still out on which of these arguments is correct, but I think it's important to understand why this is the current trend in the United States. And I think that there's a strong view that market access is something that is going to be given to like-minded countries, not countries that are challenging the United States. Strategically, I don't know if this is the right move, but I think that this should be recognized, that that's how the United States is thinking about market access. You're right that I think many of the TPP members would like to have the United States back, or they would like the United States to put on the table another TPP 2.0 that reflects some of the U.S. Concerns domestically, but at the same time allows for market access to selected members. I don't think it's coming, but this is another area of discussion that is out there. Again, going back to standard settings and why standard settings is so important is basically who shapes the rules of the game will shape the region's behavior, how they engage economically, the technologies that are being produced, the rules of those technologies, and again, governance. And I think that is understood as the priority in Washington. I think Washington's like-minded allies like Tokyo and Australia also share that view, and this is something that they would like to prioritize rather than market access.
Yeah, Stephen, those are great points you made about the market access. And I mean, outside of the actual law, the lawmaking aspect of it, I think, the Biden administration is really pushing for also, bringing jobs back to the United States, particularly when it comes to manufacturing jobs back to the United States, particularly when it comes to semiconductors, such as evidenced by the passing of the Chips and Sciences Act. Yeah. And I think, I do believe that Americans do largely support trade, and Congress, of course, is a strong proponent of it. Even Republicans support free trade, and I think some Republicans have asked for U.S. to rejoin CPTPP. But I think the Biden administration is just very sensitive to, in terms of they're giving the impression that they're shipping jobs overseas when, particularly when they were new, as in the pandemic. When Biden took office, it was still pre-vaccine days. So I think had he, started, saying from the very early on that the U.S. would join CPTPP, he may have been giving the impression, particularly in Midwest states, I would say, those states that rely heavily on manufacturing jobs as part of their state economy, that he's not really taking their concerns to heart when it comes to trade or being able to go back into work as well, because at that time there was, depending on what state you lived in, there were still, some sort of lockdowns going on. So, and then I think one other thing I should note, since I know Stephen knows that I like talking about Taiwan, I mean, yes, you did note about China, but there's another question, of course, as is, why is Taiwan not part of IPEF? So initially, as I think a lot of people know, perhaps because of Nancy Pelosi's recent visit, Congress is very strong in supporting Taiwan by bipartisan basis, and they did call for Taiwan's inclusion in IPEF, but ultimately that did not happen. I think one reason being because there are strong concerns, particularly from ASEAN countries, that if Taiwan were included, it could, China could in some way retaliate with economic tools, as I don't know about to the extent to it in the way that China did, I guess, retaliate against Taiwan when Nancy Pelosi did this. I don't know to that if it would have been at that scope, but ASEAN was very concerned about that. And I think, with the previous administration not fixating its lens on ASEAN as much, I think the Biden administration really wanted to make sure that it took ASEAN countries' concerns to heart. And that is a reason why they also hosted the U.S. ASEAN Summit shortly before Biden went to Tokyo to then formally launch IPEF. So, but in the meantime, though, shortly after IPEF was launched, there was an announcement about U.S. and Taiwan holding U.S.-Taiwan initiative on the 21st century trade. That is not, to be clear, that is not a free trade agreement. And I know there are a lot of calls among Congress, among, for example, like the U.S.-Taiwan Business Council and other thought leaders who are very strong supporters of Taiwan, for the U.S. and Taiwan to initiate talks towards a free trade agreement. So far, the Biden administration has not taken any concrete steps towards that. I think the other question is, would Taiwan actually benefit more from having this kind of bilateral discussion with the United States rather than not being a part of IPEF? the jury is still out there in regards to that, but it would be interesting if we look back in, let's say, a few years post-Biden administration, and this dialogue is still a thing, and see if it did. So just wanted to insert that in there as well, so that way Chao Ting can make comments as well.
Thanks, Eleanor.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that if you remember, after the IPEF agreement was made, there was also a separate announcement by the United States and Taiwan of an IPEF, without saying IPEF, agreement between the two states that they would focus on, the two political entities talking about some form of standard setting. So Taiwan was there, but they couldn't include it in the broader IPEF agreement because of the concerns that you mentioned of the ASEAN countries.
Thank you, Eleanor and Stephen. And Chao Ting, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, good afternoon and good evening. Good morning, Stephen. So today's topic is very interesting and important for me. In my opinion, Indo-Pacific economic framework is one part of the Indo-Pacific strategy of the U.S. So if we are talking about Indo-Pacific economic framework, we cannot ignore the background of Indo-Pacific strategy. So I would like to talk about why the U.S. has initiated the Indo-Pacific economic framework. So we have to understand this situation from perspective of big picture. What's the big picture? I think this is the U.S.-Chinese strategic rivalry. We cannot ignore this important great power politics in Indo-Pacific, especially in Southeast Asia. So before Indo-Pacific strategy, China has launched the Belt and Road Initiative. In principle, BRI is basically a geo-economic strategy of China. So China has promised to invest a lot in infrastructure delivery and so on. So basically, it's a geo-economic strategy. So traditionally, the U.S. is very strong, very powerful in military force. Therefore, many Southeast Asia countries are dependent on the security protection of the U.S. So we have seen the situation for many Southeast Asia countries. Their economy is reliant on China, while their security is dependent on U.S. So this is a basic situation. But in order to compete against China, the U.S. has disadvantage because they have not invested so many economic resources as China. I think many scholars and experts have realized the disadvantage of the U.S. For example, the very famous China expert David Xianbao, he has written one very good book. It's about a great power competition in Southeast Asia. So he has made the conclusion that the U.S. must enhance its economic dimension of its Indo-Pacific strategy. Otherwise, U.S. is not in the position to compete against China. So this is the background of Indo-Pacific economic framework. We cannot ignore this. This is the first point I would like to emphasize. And the second point, if we look at the Indo-Pacific economic framework, I have found it focuses on soft part of the economic development, like you have mentioned, standard setting and good governance and climate change. Most of them are related to soft part of the economic development. This is the strength of the United States and other airlines of the US, like Japan, like Australia. So this is understandable. They focus on this soft part. But on the other hand, for the Southeast Asia countries, I'm not sure if they really want this soft part of economic support. I think many countries are expecting that the U.S. can invest money, real money, not only good governance. They need real money for infrastructure delivery, like Marshall Plan. So after the Second World War, the U.S. has had also very hard situation in Western Europe because the Western European countries had a very bad economy. So the U.S. has invested a lot of money to support the Western European economy to balance the influence of the communist expansion. And the Marshall Plan was very successful because U.S. has invested a lot of money. So this time we have seen the U.S. is trying to compete against China from economic dimension. But if they continue to focus on soft part of these economic developments, I'm not sure if they really can win this competition. I think they need to mobilize financial resources, real money to support the Southeast Asian countries. Otherwise, it would be really difficult. I think if they only talk about good governance. Of course, good governance is very important. I'm not saying it's not important. It's really very important. But what is more important that the U.S. must invest money, not talk. So this is my observation.
Thank you very much, Chao Ting. I largely agree with your points, in particular about the investment in terms of infrastructure connectivity in Southeast Asia and South Asia, and why that's important for getting buy-in from the countries within the region. I guess the question is does the United States have to do this alone, or should it be working with countries and its partners like Japan and South Korea and India and Australia and others to use their collective resources to engage in the region? I think here the United States may not necessarily have to do it all themselves, but rather they may be able to use the good offices of countries that have pre-existing engagement in the region. And here, of course, Japan has the best reputation in terms of engaging in the region, in terms of infrastructure connectivity and investment. That may be part of the burden sharing approach to engagement and strengthening relations within the region. It's interesting, you mentioned David Chambon's book, and he did write a book on Southeast Asia recently. And his book, the conclusion highlights the fact that the United States has invested huge amounts of private capital into the region, but not the government capital in the region to produce some of the infrastructure and connectivity. So there is perhaps a role for the United States in investment. The question is, what is the best way and the best use of funds, and is that best way through the government? And here I'm not sure if the United States is well situated to do that or not, and whether it's a better approach to use countries like Japan, which have deep experience and good relationships in the region, to use those relationships rather than the United States starting from zero and building in the region. The second point that you mentioned about is standard settings the right way, or these soft forms of investment in the region, is that the right way to attract Southeast Asian countries? Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and I think you're right. Countries like Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam and Philippines and even Indonesia may not be as concerned about these areas as other countries within the region, and they may prefer just the capital to build the infrastructure connectivity. At the same time, most of these capitals have severe challenges with regards to the environment. They have severe challenges with regards to overpopulation and social economic gaps. And those soft sides are also important in terms of making these regions more sustainable and providing a real tangible contribution to the region. So I'd like to hear more from others if they have any views, or Chao Ting, your response.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. Yeah, you're right. I think both hard and soft side of the development are important. Now, China is good at the hard part, and the US is good at the soft part. If they can combine, that will be the perfect. But I think you are also right. The US, Japan, and Australia, maybe some other Western countries, actually they can mobilize much more financial resources than China. But most of them are private capital. So the US government is not in the position to order the private capital to invest in Southeast Asia countries. But China is the so-called state capitalism. Therefore, the Chinese state is in the position to mobilize large resources, including financial and human resource, to invest in Southeast Asia countries. For example, the China North high-speed railway is one very good example. Today there is a competition between U.S. and China in Indo-Pacific region, particularly in Southeast Asia's geopolitical, geoeconomic, and the infrastructure competition. So, in my opinion, through Belt and Road Initiative, China has triggered the competition between China and the US and Japan, probably. I think from the perspective of the Southeast Asian countries, this is really good. That means both China and the US, the two superpowers, are competing against each other to attract the attention of the Southeast Asian countries. This is good for them, and they have now more than one choice. In the past, the technology capital and know-how are mainly from Western countries, including Japan, but now they have China as another alternative source. So this situation is really good for the Indo-Pacific countries. I mean, competition. I think this is one contribution of China's BRI because they have triggered the competition to provide more choice for Southeast Asian countries. So this is my observation. I mean, the great power politics is not always bad. Like what we have observed now, China has BRI and the US has the Indo-Pacific economic framework. They are competing against each other. So this is really an output of this great power competition. But on the other hand, they should work very hard to avoid escalation. For example, military conflict. This is bad for all. For both China and the US, military conflict is also very bad. So if they can control this competition, if they can avoid military conflict, I think the great power competition is really not bad. Maybe very good for local countries.
That's true. I guess the question is the competition sustainable, and what does that mean for recipient countries, not just Southeast Asia and South Asia? And I have serious questions about the sustainability of the Chinese model. Of course, the pandemic has challenged the model's applicability. It can no longer export resources and human capital or laborers in the same way because of the pandemic. Now we have growing suspicions of China, and I think the responses to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, and now with another U.S. congressional visit just arriving yesterday, we have another military drill going to be happening in and around Taiwan. I wonder about how competitive the Chinese model can be and how countries can benefit. And there's really open questions about is IPEF a long-term, and is it sustainable if China does become a weaker power? And will countries like Japan and South Korea remain on the same page of the book, providing ODA and FDI and other forms of assistance to the region if there's no longer a unifying challenge that they need to worry about?
If I may insert a few comments, kind of circling around the soft power aspect and perhaps a bit about the uncertainties of IPEF going forward. I think this does somewhat overlap with the soft power aspect about the first point I made, which is that IPEF countries or countries that are part of IPEF, they can decide which pillar or pillars to join, and I think that caters to as Stephen or Chao-Ting said, not all countries are countries aren't equally invested in supply chain resilience or taxation, for example. So I think a purpose of IPEF is to allow countries to make it so that they can feel like they're putting their eggs in the baskets that they care most about. So in this, maybe like the Fiji Islands or ASEAN countries, for example, it's climate change. So therefore, they're going to put their eggs in the climate change, or sorry, I think it's the resilience pillar basket. So in that sense, I think one interesting trend or question that I have is, whether it's IPEF or other frameworks that the United States introduces, and not just in regards to standard settings, will it be flexible so that member countries can decide which pillars or working groups or whatever to join going forward? And I think if that's the case, that might be an opportunity for the U.S. to further engage with countries, in this case IPEF, without having to incentivize them to join just by market access alone, especially if that's something that the administration is very hesitant in offering, which they definitely are right now. And I think in terms of IPEF and uncertainty, I mean, Stephen was talking about China as well as Chao-Ting. I think as Gina Raimondo said on Bloomberg earlier last week, she did say that Nancy Pelosi's visit certainly complicated things geopolitically when it comes to Biden perhaps deciding whether or not to lift the tariffs against Chinese goods. And I don't disagree with that. It sounds like he will make some sort of decision soon. And there is a lot of debate within the administration itself. You do have people like Gina Raimondo, for example, and I believe Janet Yellen, who believe that it would be better if the tariffs were cut. Whereas Catherine Tai, who is the U.S. Trade Representative, Ambassador Tai, she is more, as at least before the Nancy Pelosi visit, she did say that the tariffs do serve a strategic purpose. So there's a lot circling around IPEF in regard to U.S.'s economic engagement more broadly in the Pacific, and of course perhaps IPEF being perceived by countries that are part of it as kind of serving as like a counterweight to increase Chinese economic activity and influence in the region more broadly. I think one other question to ask or ponder over going forward is, because the IPEF negotiations are only set to last about 12 to 18 months, which is still before the 2024 midterm. Actually, no, if it's 18 months, it'll be after the 2024 presidential elections, I believe. But the question is, if Biden loses the 2024 election to whether it's Donald Trump or some other Republican candidate, is IPEF going to be something that they actually embrace, as the Biden administration has largely embraced certain broader facets of the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy more broadly? That's something that I'm actually I've been thinking about for quite some time. Oh no, did we lose Stephen?
Oh, I am not sure. Oh, yes.
Hi, there, okay. I was lost and got kicked out of my own room, and now I'm back.
Okay, so I hope that you heard Eleanor or most of what she said.
I think I missed the last 20 seconds or
Sure,
so.
I can repeat it.
Yeah.
No worries. So I think the last point that I made about kind of the uncertainty of the future of IPEF is that IPEF negotiations are set to last between 12 to 18 months. So if it's 12 months, it's before the 2024 presidential election here. But if it's 18 months, I do believe, if I'm doing my math correctly, it is after November, which means, my question is, in the event that Biden doesn't get reelected, whether it's Trump or some other Republican candidate who becomes the president-elect, will he or she embrace IPEF after Biden leaves office? Because the Biden administration on a macro level has largely embraced his predecessors' Indo-Pacific strategy. It's more, I think, the economics component of the Indo-Pacific strategy is something that the Trump administration and the Biden administration don't see completely eye to eye. So what I wonder is, given since Trump left office, obviously a lot has already happened in the Indo-Pacific and, of course, the world more broadly. But when 2024 rolls over, if a Republican candidate does become president or president-elect then president in January 2025, will he or she still embrace and push for IPEF? Is something that I've been thinking about for some time.
That's a really good question. I think there is more overlap between the former administration and the Biden administration in terms of how they think about trade access, the pressures of the middle class, and how they're thinking about great power competition in the Indo-Pacific. And with that, I don't see a return to the TPP. And I think IPEF, if it focuses on standard setting and building flexible partnerships within the region and increasing the role of Japan and other countries in terms of supply chain resilience, that I think it would not be inconsistent with their domestic policies and their interests in competing with China. So this is something really, really interesting to be thinking about. Is trade the primary vehicle or tool that the United States needs to compete with China, or is it other forms and other forms of relationships, such as an IPEF, that will have more stakeholder buy-in? And right now, I'm very much leaning towards IPEF as a better model for the United States to engage in the region and to shape the region's development.
And Justin, yes, please.
Yes, excuse me. So I would like to add one more point of IPEF. So if we look at the 12 participating countries of IPEF, so there is one factor that 3 Southeastern Asian countries are not the member of IPEF. The 3 countries are Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. Okay, so if we look at the 3 countries, all of them have very good relationship with China. They are more pro-Beijing, okay, but they are not the part of the IPEF. So this is really interesting. This is another reason why IPEF is actually the product of geopolitical competition between US and China. So the 3 countries which support Beijing have not participated in IPEF. So this is a reason. Okay, so sorry, I have forgotten what I want to say. But I mean, IPEF is really one part of the geopolitical strategy of the U.S. So I have forgotten what I want to say. I will do it later. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. And I can see Mikio, who has raised his hand, and I'm trying to bring him up on stage. It's a little bit difficult. I don't know why. So, well, I hope that he'll come up.
Oh,
Right.
I did notice that Hiroaki
Yes,
asked a few
Hiroki
questions
has,
in the group chat.
yes. Yes, so we can go there. And his first question is, what is IPEF's strategy for facilitating the ratification of a CPTPP, especially by the US, China, and Taiwan? So I wonder who can take this question.
The U.S. strategy
Yes.
towards the
Well,
CTPPP.
well, basically, it's a little bit different. It is the IPEF's strategy for facilitating the ratification of CPTPP. And so, especially what do the US, China, and Taiwan think, I believe? It's a little bit loaded. I mean, the question is a little bit difficult to break down.
Okay,
So,
I think that in terms of the China and Taiwan joining the TPP, I think that this is complicated. Taiwan or China won't. It will pressure certain members of the current TPP members not to allow Taiwan to join the TPP, and I don't think certain members of the TPP would like China to join the TPP either. So I think that the initiative of both China and Taiwan to apply to the TPP, while superficially is about trade, I think that the possibility of either joining the TPP is rather quite low, and I think this is disconnected from IPEF in terms of IPEF's role in facilitating ratification of the CPTP, as well as the US's role in it.
yes, thank you for the answer. And there are a couple of other questions, so I'll go down with them. Like, how about investments by Japan and China in Mexico, specifically the US-Mexico border, constructing a large-scale EV charging stand infrastructure, blooming green economy, improving the US-Mexico, US-China relationships? How about in Tijuana, Baja California, Mexico? So these are probably, yeah, I'm not sure that this question actually is relevant to this discussion. So probably we can well see the next one. Investments by Chinese or Japanese companies for EVs charging stand infrastructure in Taiwan. Is it possible then? Okay. Any opinions on this?
So Hiroaki, thank you for the questions. I think that your interest in Japanese and Chinese investment in Mexico is really significant and important. Japan has a long track record of investing in the United States and Mexico. The new NAFTA 2.0 agreement means that more products need to be made within the United States and before they are come onto market. But that being said, both China and Japan see Mexico as an access point to the U.S. market. This will become increasingly difficult, in my assumption, from the Chinese side, and it may be facilitated by the Japanese side, as one is seen as a more reliable partner than the other. In terms of constructing a large-scale EV charging stand infrastructure, well, I think that we'll have to wait and see. I'm not confident that in the U.S. and China being able to cooperate here. I don't see that the technological sharing is there, and I don't see that the trust is there to continue with that. On the Japanese side, there's many different institutions and many lateral relationships that Japan works with the United States and other partners to engage in cooperating of the technological areas that you mentioned, and that may include not only with the U.S.-Mexico relationship, but also in Taiwan.
Thank you for that, Stephen. And yes, Chao-Ting?
Okay, Stephen, actually, I have one question. Just now, I have forgotten. Now I remember this question. You have mentioned decoupling between the Western countries and China is impossible. I do agree because China and many other countries have very strong economic connection. decoupling is really not realistic. But on the other hand, you have also mentioned the importance of supply chain resilience. This is one very important element of IPEF. Maybe China is not the target of the supply chain resilience. But on the other hand, I have observed the statement from the Treasury Secretary of the U.S., Madam Yellen. She has emphasized the so-called friend shoring. So this is very interesting. In the past, especially in the time of the globalization, many multinational companies have implemented the strategy of offshore. China is a large beneficiary of this offshoring strategy. Now China is called as the workshop of the world. So, but now the U.S. has realized the supply chain is probably too reliant on China. For example, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the European countries have realized that the reliance on Russian energy is dangerous. So they want to reduce this reliance on authoritarian regimes. And recently, there is one Gemma report indicating that if there is a trade war between Germany and China, the north of Germany will be 6 times larger than Brexit. So they are talking about the emergence of reducing reliance on Chinese supply chain. So I think this is probably the background of the idea of friend shoring. That means in the future, the US and other Western airlines will enhance cooperation among like-minded countries. They will withdraw from China probably. For example, Japan. Japan has initiated some fund to support Japanese enterprise to encourage them to leave mainland China. They encourage Japanese enterprise to have facilities in Southeast Asia countries, including Vietnam and probably India as well. So my question is about friend shoring. What's your evaluation of friend shoring? What is the implication and the impact?
Thanks, Xiaoting. So I think so-called friend-shoring has its limits. The Chinese production network, in terms of its size, in terms of its regional labor supply, seasonal labor supply, in terms of the ecosystem that exists, where there's many businesses that coexist side by side and they engage in their technological development in tandem, not together, but in many ways they're producing things side by side that work in each other's technologies, make replacing the Chinese production network very, very difficult in the short to mid-term. The price advantage in China still remains significant. I don't see an alternative to that broadly, but in particular areas that are sensitive technologies, we will have to selectively diversify and pick up the cost. We talk a lot about the so-called West decoupling or selectively diversifying away from the United States, but we should also, or from the world, from China. But we should also be keenly aware that China has also engaged in a process of selective diversification through its dual circulation strategy, through the BRI and as a geoeconomic tool. So this is not a one-way process, it's a two-way process, and the ultimate outcome of this selective diversification or untangling of globalization, we really don't know the direction, but ultimately I think as consumers we will face it in terms of prices. Friendshoring, again, what can replace 400 million or 300 million manufacturing workers? I just don't know, and I'd love to hear some alternative views on this.
Thank you for your answer.
Yes, Eleanor, if you have anything to add to this, please.
Sure. I mean, I can just say that I think friendshoring or selectively decoupling, or what one of my professors said is tapering away from China, investments from China, is a thing. And I think it started particularly with COVID hit. I think many countries, including the United States, realized that, for example, with critical technologies like semiconductors, for example, there are real dangers perhaps for manufacturing of semiconductors to be geographically concentrated too much in either one continent or even one, I'll say, political entity in the case of Taiwan. So I think that's a reason why friendshoring did become a thing, as well as, in addition to COVID, there's, of course, weather anomalies, and as Xiaoting pointed out about geopolitical tensions, whether it be the war in Ukraine. And I think that's something that countries like Germany are learning quite a bit. When you have something that's important as gasoline, you rely on one country too much on a really important product such as gasoline. You can't easily replicate gasoline, right? Same thing as semiconductors. What alternatives do we have? And I think that's where the idea of friendshoring, which honestly, I think it has really turned into a buzzword these days, has brought into light. So the Japanese government, I do remember that the Japanese government offered incentives not last year anymore, in 2020, shortly after the pandemic, to incentivize companies to leave China, to go back to Japan, or I believe they could go elsewhere, so long as they left Japan. I've heard reports, multiple reports, that very few companies took this offer. Actually, there were a lot more applications than the government the government had the funds to allow these kind of relocations. So I'm not sure for that particular story just exactly how many Japanese companies took that offer. But I do think that it really, the whole friendshoring idea really garnered attention, I would say, starting around when COVID-19 hit. In terms of whether it's a good idea or not, I don't think it's a bad idea in a sense, especially I do think there are real dangers perhaps in having, relying on one country or a political entity for critical and emerging technologies, for example, or gasoline or oil or whatever can't be easily replicated. But then at the same time, though, we obviously know from this past year that the world is rapidly changing. So what if in a few years, as a history major, I like to imagine scenarios. So what if in a few years there is some sort of dilemma, whether it be one not caused necessarily by one country, so whether that be a weather anomaly, some other black swan event like COVID-19, maybe not that scope necessarily, or some sort of geopolitical tension to make it so that whatever friend we consider a friend right now, and that we as in the United States and other like-minded countries have friendshored to, or thinking about friendshoring to, we're no longer doing that 4 to 5 years from now. And I think if we are, for anyone who's a strong proponent of friendshoring, they can't just think necessarily in the present term. And I think that's something that the United States, personally, I think they tend to do that more often than not, when it's most important to think more longer term. But that's something, if for anybody who's a proponent of friendshoring, really need to think in terms of not necessarily just being able to meet the demands of right now, but meeting the demands of whatever industry in the long term as well. I hope that answered somebody's question.
Yeah, Eleanor, you make some really good points, and I think that friendshoring, again, has its limits. Not to rehash some of the challenges of the former administration, but allies of the former administration, whether it was Japan or Korea or Canada, Germany, there was a lot of pressure and stress in the relationship associated with the leadership in the White House, and the capitals of those countries I mentioned were, they really wondered about the future of the relationship if this is how close partners could be treated. And I think this speaks to Eleanor's point, is that friendshoring is interesting, but it can be affected by political leaders in a way that is very unpredictable. And we don't know who will be in the White House in 2024, but my assumption is if it's not a Biden administration, that those same allies that I mentioned would be concerned about the stability of bilateral relations with the United States, and engaging in a commitment to collective reshoring or friendshoring.
Yes, and I think the other part, in addition to political leadership at the executive level, is also the legislative leadership as well, because ultimately, when it comes to trade agreements, I mean, Congress has quite a bit of authority, and unfortunately, good or bad, they didn't let trade authority, they let it expire. I think it was last July, I believe. So I think we have to also, in addition to looking at presidential elections and changes in leadership at that level, we should also be looking at, in the United States case at least, the midterm elections as well, because even though at the macro level, I do think Republicans and Democrats do see eye to eye in seeing China as the pacing challenge of the 21st century, I'll say so far. On the more granular level, when it comes to economics, when it comes to tariffs, I know that's a little bit outside of the IPEF bubble here, but they don't necessarily. Those are the parts that they don't see eye to eye, and depending on how you look at it, the more granular levels where they don't see eye to eye might be just as important, if not more, than seeing eye to eye on the macro level as well.
Yeah, I agree with you.
So, yeah, it remains to be seen how the future administrations of the United States, how consistent they will be with the current strategy. If I have understood you well, Eleanor. Okay, yeah. Well, like many other things, it remains to be seen, and hopefully there will be consistency, and hopefully there will be also no escalation of what is going on at the moment here in the Indo-Pacific and also other parts of the world. And with this, oh, there is one more, let's see, in the room chat. Yes, Hiroaki. Okay, so probably this is, talked, what's, okay. Hiroaki, that's what you did recently? Or talked with minister from Mexico Embassy in Japan about, okay, an EV charging infra construction project. They are impressed and welcoming such a project will be emerged. That is my impression. Well, there is also, it remains to be seen, I believe. And yes, okay. So the last one, is it a question maybe? Achieving Chinese foods and low-tech products to US via Mexico for facilitating trades. Is it a comment, Hiroaki, or is it a question? I'm sorry, just it's a little bit unclear to me. I'll take it as a comment at the moment. All right, so thank you very much indeed. And comments. Okay, thank you. Thank you for letting me know. All right, so Stephen and Eleanor and Shouting, it seems that we have actually exhausted the points at this point of time. If you have any other comments to just wrap up the discussion at the moment, please go ahead and do that. Stephen, how about you?
Okay, so I will end with my comments about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and reiterate what I said about the participants and how it's inclusive in nature. And I think Eleanor added more to this discussion by saying that you don't have to buy everything within the IPEF agreement. You could take it selectively, and I think this is really, really interesting and makes it more inclusive. Second, I mentioned those key areas that they're focusing on, and then third, the importance of standard setting and how standard setting will shape the broader Indo-Pacific region and likely beyond the Indo-Pacific region. And I think that those are key take-homes that you should be understanding. The IPEF should also be understood in terms of strong support by Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and other members for the United States engaging in the region. They understand that it's the start of the process of the IPEF, not the end process. And when we look at IPEF in 2 years from now, 4 years from now, and more, that we will see more teeth to the IPEF. And I don't mean teeth in terms of military teeth. I mean more substance and more initiatives. And this is what happens when you form new institutions, is that they evolve for and to meet the needs of the current but also future needs of the economy, trade, and the digital economy. So I think that's really important to take home. And then lastly, I think that we should really think about what about the sustainability of these initiatives within the United States in terms of the challenges within the domestic sphere in the United States, but also I think we should be thinking about how competitive China is and can be in the long term in terms of sustainability. And I think this will also shape the IPEF and other agreements moving forward. And if you think that China is going to be able to compete effectively and marshal its resources and deal with all the domestic contradictions within the Chinese economy and get back to 10 and 12% growth a year, then you think that it can compete effectively with the United States. If you think that the demographic pressures and the domestic contradictions are going to overwhelm the government and slow down the economy and make it not an effective competitor, then this will have different implications for IPEF and other initiatives. I think these are useful framing tools in terms of thinking about the future scenarios of moving forward, and I encourage you to look at these initiatives through some of those different scenarios to understand the different possible conclusions that will emerge.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, with this, I would like to proceed with closing the room. So we'll be here once again in 2 weeks. It will be August the 29th, when the topic will be the Pacific Islands Great Power Competition and the Indo-Pacific. If you have some time on that day to join us, please do that. We'll open the room just a few minutes before 8 o'clock, and we're looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much indeed, and have a great week.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.